This is Pacifica Radio's Letters and Politics. On today's show,
they had suffered tsunamis in the past, and they had folk memories of terrible smongs, or oceans coming onto land, and they began to transmit stories of those tsunamis that they survived in lullabies that they sang to babies. The stories were in their nursery rhymes that were taught at homes and in schools. So as soon as everyone saw the beach retreat, the tide retreating and the ocean leaving the beach so bare, everyone ran to the high ground and they all survived.
A conversation on myths, folklore, and lullabies, and what they tell us about the environment. Our guest is Adrienne Mayer. She is the author of the book Mythopedia, a brief compendium of natural history lore. That's next on Letters and Politics. But first, the news.
For Pacifica Radio, I'm Scott Baba. Israeli and Hamas officials are meeting in Egypt today to discuss a potential ceasefire in Gaza. The talks are taking place in Sharm el-Sheikh and are focused on a U.S. proposed ceasefire's first stage, including the partial withdrawal of Israeli forces and the release of hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners. Blake Sifton reports.
The negotiations between delegations from Israel and Hamas will focus on the logistics of a ceasefire, the identities of the Palestinian prisoners to be released for Israeli hostages, and the terms of the Israeli military's initial withdrawal ahead of the exchange. Hamas is expected to push for the release of several high-profile prisoners serving life sentences that Israel has been reluctant to exchange, as well as a wider Israeli military withdrawal in Gaza than was outlined in the plan proposed by President Trump. Israeli airstrikes in Gaza have continued despite President Trump's call for the Israeli military to halt its bombardment.
And that was Blake Sifton reporting. Meanwhile, Israel said today that it deported 171 people, including Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg, who were detained for joining a Gaza-bound aid flotilla intercepted last week. Lawyers with the Adala Association, representing more than 470 detainees, said about 150 activists remain in Israel's Kziai prison, with 40 on hunger strikes to protest conditions. They alleged detainees faced violence and humiliation after being seized in international waters. Israel denied any mistreatment, saying detainees' rights were respected and accusing one activist of biting a medical worker. Arriving in Greece, Thunberg said that it is not enough to just pay lip service to addressing global injustice.
Action was challenging our extremely violent business as usual that is preventing these war crimes from happening. And that is what this story is about. We cannot take our eyes away from Gaza, from all the places of the world that are suffering, living on the forefronts of this business as usual systems: Congo, Sudan, Afghanistan, Gaza, and many, many more. What we are doing is the bare minimum.
The flotilla's interception sparked global protests and welcomes for returning activists. Former Barcelona Mayor Ada Colau called the detention dehumanizing, but said it was nothing compared to conditions in Gaza. Ukraine said today that it struck deep inside Russia overnight, hitting a major ammunition plant, an oil terminal in Crimea, and a key weapons depot in one of its largest long-range attacks of the war. The Ukrainian General Staff said its forces used domestically made drones and missiles to hit the Sverdlov ammunition plant in Russia's Nizhny Novgorod region, sparking explosions and fires. It also reported attacks on an oil terminal in Crimea and an ammunition depot of the Russia's 18th Combined Arms Army. Russian officials confirmed widespread Ukrainian drone attacks over 14 regions in Crimea, but claimed air defenses shot down 251 drones, with no significant damage reported. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Ukraine used only locally produced weapons in the strikes as the country ramps up domestic arms production and aims to supply half its frontline needs by year's end. Ukraine also plans to begin exporting surplus weapons later this year. Violent clashes have erupted between the M23 rebels and a pro-government militia in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo. It's forced hundreds of civilians to flee their homes. Chris Ochemringa reports.
Fighting in the east of the Democratic Republic of Congo has continued despite efforts by the US and Qatar to restore peace. Locals say the M23 rebels have attacked positions of the Wazalendo militia allied to the Congolese government in Masisi territory. Hundreds of civilians have fled their homes. Both warring sides accuse each other of violating a ceasefire. The M23 rebels are led by ethnic Tutsis who say they are fighting to protect their community from a Hutu militia backed by the DRC government. But the DRC has denied the accusation and blamed Rwanda for supporting the rebels to plunder its minerals. Kigali has also denied the charge. The conflict has claimed thousands of lives and displaced more than 3 million people since 2021. Chris Ochamringa, Kinshasa.
Trump administration officials said today that the president is weighing a plan to admit as few as 7,500 refugees this year, most of them white South Africans. This would mark what would be a historic low for the U.S. refugee program. Last year, the Biden administration set a target of 125,000 refugee admissions, and since 1980, the United States has taken in an average of 65,000 refugees a year. The proposal, not yet finalized or sent to Congress, comes amid nationwide immigration raids and a government shutdown that has halted new refugee arrivals. Advocates warn the plan would push aside tens of thousands of people already vetted for resettlement. Trump first suspended the refugee program in January and later created a special program for Afrikaners, citing discrimination, a claim South Africa denies. Democratic lawmakers accuse the administration of open defiance of the law, saying the delay leaves more than 100,000 refugees stranded abroad. A federal judge temporarily blocked the Trump administration from deploying any National Guard units to Oregon, including the California National Guard. California and Oregon sought the temporary restraining order after the president sent Guard members from California to Oregon earlier Sunday. On Saturday, the same judge had temporarily blocked the administration from deploying Oregon National Guard troops to Portland. U.S. District Judge Karen Immergitt, who was appointed by President Donald Trump during his first term, issued her second, more sweeping order late Sunday after she upbraided the federal government's attorney and questioned how the move to send the California and Texas troops to Oregon was not, quote, in direct contravention of the order that was issued yesterday. I'm Scott Baba for Pacifica Radio.
Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Again, I do feel compelled at the top of the show to remind listeners and radio stations that air this program that my final day hosting the show will be on October 16th. So a little under 2 weeks from now, I will be stepping down from my job at KPFA. I am wildly thankful to everyone who has appeared on the show over the years, everyone who has worked on this show over the years, and everyone who has donated to this show over the years. I do hope you'll continue to donate to this radio station. I'm also wildly thankful to the people who just hung around with me at this time. This is still my community, and I will be back for special broadcasts. But it is time for me to move on to other work, at least attempt to try to do other work. That does include storytelling projects. I think the stories will contain myth, folklore, and history, as does Letters on Politics, but it will also be more personal. In the end, the only thing I'm really qualified to talk about is myself, and I'm not even sure I'm really that qualified to do that. But if you want to stay in touch, we can. I do have a podcast that I'm playing around with. It's called Letters from Mitch, because that's exactly what it is. My letter to you about how I navigate the world and the stories that I'm interested in while doing it. There's also, of course, a Substack letter, because that's what everyone does these days. The Substack letter just mirrors what you'd find in the podcast. Just look for Mitch Jeserich at Substack. No one's ever spelled Jeserich correctly, so it is Jeserich, just as it sounds. Both the newsletter and podcast, again, are the same thing, and really, right now, they're just me fooling around with stuff, because I thought I should have something there as I step away to let people know how we can remain in touch. Anyways, enough about that, because I want to get into today's show because it is fascinating, because we are going to be in conversation about myth, folklore, and the environment, and how stories that have been passed down over time help explain the environment of the past, how it has changed, and how also it has informed our world. Earlier this morning, I spoke to Adrienne Mayer, who is a research scholar in classics and the history of science at Stanford University, and she is the author of the book Mythopedia, a brief compendium of natural history lore. Adrienne Mayer, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you here. Again, an emphasis on sort of mostly ancient stories, though you have some modern stories in here too that we'll talk about. But looking at stories and the environment is always important. And there's sort of this new field I'd like to ask you about. It's called geomyths. Tell me about that.
Well, as you say, it is a relatively new field of study called geomythology, and it is enhancing our understanding of Earth's history and the landscape and changes in the landscape over time. The field began in the 70s when a geologist named Dorothy Vitiano, I'll say that again, Dorothy Vitiano, wrote about legends of the Earth in the mid-70s. She was a geologist who was interested in classical stories and especially Plato's thought experiment about Atlantis. And she asked other classicists if there were myths about civilizations that disappeared due to natural disasters. And that sort of started the field, but it didn't really start to take off, I would say, until about the year 2000. And that's when scientists and historians began paying attention. So I'll just define a geomyth very simply. These are sort of legends and oral traditions and stories found in cultures around the world. And these are stories that attempt to account for or explain anomalous or puzzling evidence of natural phenomena in a local landscape. Try to explain how things came about. How did mountains get formed? How did islands begin? How did the oceans get created? And they also record massive geological events. And once again, either from people in antiquity looking at the evidence in nature, or sometimes actually eyewitness accounts of people who had witnessed huge natural disasters like the creation of Crater Lake in Idaho or in Oregon, or various other disasters like volcanoes or tsunamis.
I imagine creation stories are a rich area to find stories about the environment.
Absolutely. One really provocative question that's raised by these sort of timeless and universal human impulses to explain the landscape is, so these are based on oral legends that go way, way back over generations, and geomythology raises that question: just how far back can cultural memory extend, and how long can a geomyth be perpetuated orally by people and still contain kernels or germs of actual real science and history and eyewitness accounts? So how long do spoken traditions survive? And scholars call this the longevity of orality question, and they used to think that it couldn't be very long, but now that people are really beginning to study geomythology, they find that, for instance, the Aborigines of Australia, who have lived in the same place and observing keenly the land around them and trying to explain it, and also explaining and recording eyewitness accounts of volcanoes and earthquakes, things like that, some of their stories have been perpetuated for 20,000 years. And the reason we know this is because you can date the geomythological upheavals that they're describing in their folklore can be dated by people who study volcanoes and earthquakes and rising water levels or lowering water levels, things like that. Those can be dated. And so the details in the stories actually can be tied to specific events. And that's a new development, which is quite exciting.
It's really remarkable to me how some stories have persevered over time, or at least elements of them, right? I mean, because I think of the game Telephone. One person
Yes.
tells one, and then the farther you get along, the more the story changes. So you would automatically think, like, yeah, these stories have changed. They can't go that far back. But when you were talking about these volcanoes and things, I was also thinking we did a show about the Indo-European language, and how even looking back at the history of language, we could see that how remarkable it is that many of these stories or elements of these stories have survived over time.
Yes, and they've survived with their relevant and specific salient details, because a lot of these stories, especially about natural disasters and catastrophes, these are life and death issues, and the stories need these details embedded in them to help people understand and survive natural disasters. So especially with something like tsunamis or floods or melting glaciers and things like that, the stories have to be exciting enough to be, you want to pass the story along, right? You want to tell people about this story, but it also has specific details that are early warning systems for cultures that are still oral. They give you warnings and advice about exactly how to save your life if these things happen. So I think the stories that are about natural disasters are really the ones that last the longest sometimes, because they're life and death issues that are ongoing.
I mean, it just makes me think there's an evolutionary aspect to storytelling in of itself.
Oh, absolutely. These stories have been told ever since human beings started looking around their landscape and trying to explain things, and especially for survival. I mean, this is these stories, I think, go back all the way to the first humans that were gathered around a fire. And what do you do around a campfire? You tell stories.
That's right. I mean, I've always thought stories is so human. We learn from stories. We fight over stories. We form communities, and we love each other over stories.
Absolutely. And as I was saying, these stories that are about natural disasters and how to survive them, there is a problem with how long stories about disasters can last. A lot of folklorists point out that there seems to be a limit at 3 generations. Grandparents tell their children these stories about a natural disaster, say, and the parents then, or the grandparents, tell it same story to the grandchildren. But then after the 3rd generation, sometimes the stories begin to fade, and some of these stories that I've collected in my book, though, have lasted for, as I say, thousands of years, even 10,000s of years. So somehow these stories have to get past that 3-generation obstacle. And so, as you say, I think, these stories are the kind of storytelling that's existed since the first humans invented language. Now, there's just a drive, as you mentioned, there's a drive to explain perplexing, confusing, weird, or dangerous things in nature. So the stories I look for to find geomyths are almost always about nature.
It's interesting to me, and I wonder if it's just speculation or if we have a good sense of why is it that within a family, a natural disaster might be forgotten in 3 generations or 4 generations, yet some of these stories collectively will be remembered for thousands of years. It almost makes me think of, like, is that when a story becomes a meme? And I don't mean meme the way we use
right.
it. And I don't mean meme the way we use it today, as like online, something gets really popular. I mean it in, I guess, the way Richard Dawkins sort of meant it, where everyone learns this.
Yes, it's like a touchstone for the culture. So there's a certain pride in having survived a natural disaster or having witnessed it.
Yeah.
And so the story is exciting in that way, too. So it's another reason it would be perpetuated. Also, these stories belong to cultures, although certain people or clans may have sort of a possession or an ownership of that story. They want to share it because it's a cultural meme, as you say. And so when someone is telling this story, there are a host of people who will jump in to correct you if you get a detail wrong. I mean, you know this, if you have children and you're reading them the same favorite story and you try to skip over something or change the wording slightly, they'll let you know. And so I think the same thing must have happened with these oral traditions about earth-shaking events in nature.
Yeah, the oral tradition is a collective process.
Yeah.
In your book, Adrienne Mayer, Mythopedia, a brief compendium of natural history lore, you do look at stories from around the world. And when I think of geomyths, I think of some of the, I guess, obvious ones, the great flood of Gilgamesh that I think is sort of brought over to the Hebrew Bible. Then there is also, I think of the Nile River in Egypt. And you have some others. There are many stories about water and about floods, including, and if I say any of these wrong, you will correct me, the Jishi Gorge, which is, we're talking about the great flood myth that would lead to the Yellow River.
Yes, that's a very old myth and a very complex one, and only recently was it discovered that it contains very specific details about the actual huge, catastrophic, earth-shaking flood that sent the Yellow River into the lowlands of China and then caused ongoing problems of flood. That's just been a perpetual problem in China until someone was able to figure out how to control the water by making irrigation ditches and gates and things like that. So that is a recent discovery of a oral myth that contains real knowledge of interest to historians of China, but also hydrologists and people who want to see how people were impacted by floods and then how they reacted to control them. The other one that I think is quite interesting, we talked about tsunamis, but you remember the gigantic tsunami and earthquake that happened in 2004.
Yeah.
It was I think it was an over 9 magnitude earthquake, and then there was a gigantic tsunami in the Indian Ocean and in Malaysia. I think it killed more than 200,000 people in 14 different countries. So Thailand, Indonesia, India, Sri Lanka, even Somalia in Africa. And it was just a gigantic, one of the most deadly natural disasters in modern times. But there are a couple success stories, and that's what really interested me. So I looked a little closer at that. And why did some local people survive? And it was because their culture had been maintaining oral histories of tsunamis in the past. And in the language of Indonesia, a tsunami is called a smong, S-M-O-N-G, ocean coming onto land. And the epicenter of that earthquake in 2004 was on the west coast of Sumatra. And there was a massive tsunami, of course, just destroyed thousands of people, hundreds of schools, hospitals, bridges, and homes. Of Sumatra itself, it was tens of thousands, almost 100,000 people lived on that island, and yet on the island Simalui, where the epicenter of the earthquake was, and the towering 100-foot tsunami arrived, only 7 people died in the disaster out of 78,000. And the reason is that the people of Simalui, of that island, they had suffered tsunamis in the past. And they had folk memories of terrible smongs, or oceans coming onto land. And they began to transmit stories of those tsunamis that they survived in lullabies that they sang to babies. The stories were in their nursery rhymes that were taught at homes and in schools. Grandparents told the kids, and children sang, little rhymes and nursery rhymes. And there were, this nation has, our culture has some lots of folk songs. And this story of tsunamis was even embedded in their folk songs. So all of these songs and lullabies and nursery rhymes served as a sort of early warning system, so that they knew all the signs, because the signs were talked about in their nursery rhymes and their lullabies. And the certain sign that we all know is the sudden reversing of the tide, as the ocean suddenly retreats from a beach. And all of a sudden there's a huge beach where there was only just a small strip of sand, and now there's a huge beach, and that happens about 10 to 20 minutes before a gigantic tsunami is going to suddenly surge back. And so these songs and lullabies and nursery rhymes all talked about that, and the people had already built tsunami escape refuges on the high grounds. So as soon as everyone saw the beach retreat, the tide retreating, and the ocean leaving the beach so bare, everyone ran to the high ground, and they all survived, except for 7 people. So I think that's just a brilliant example of how this oral tradition could save lives.
Lullabies, kind of the forgotten form, right, of the oral tradition.
Yes, remember, if you think about lullabies, they're sometimes a little disconcerting as an adult when you rock-a-bye baby and the cradle will fall. I mean, there are some lullabies, they just have some violence and ominous things still embedded in them, and we're not really sure where they came from. But for the people of Simalui, it was life-saving.
Talk to me about monsters. I'm fascinated in monsters, what monsters mean in society, what they mean in story, what they mean in folklore. And I suspect a lot of monsters come in some way from, or actually they kind of all do, right? They all come from the forest or some deep, dark place that is unknown to civilization.
Right. Monsters are just sort of the other, the non-human, but they sometimes have aspects of familiar, either humans or animals. And most monster, a good monster is a composite, right? It's usually a combination of things. So if you think of dragons as monsters, they have features of all kinds of different species of creatures that are familiar, but when they're combined in a sort of hybrid animal, they seem very dangerous. But also people make monsters out of inexplicable or treacherous natural events or entities. For instance, there are a bunch of oral traditions and folklore about glaciers, a very large glacier in the Alps in Austria, and the glacier sometimes, as glaciers do, retreats or surges forth. And when it suddenly surges forth, it could actually destroy villages and crops. And then when it melts, it causes disastrous floods. So this particular glacier in the Alps was pictured as a monster, the name translates as gnawing monster, something that gnaws away at the land. but it also caused gigantic floods. And so there were pictures and stories about this glacier as a monster. So monster can cover all sorts of things that are dangerous or unusual or unaccountable or puzzling. And one of my favorite stories, there's a terrifying monster of nomad folklore in West Africa that I wrote about in my book called Jobar. This was a monster that parents would, grown-ups would use to keep their children behaving on these long nomadic migrations across the desert in Central and West Africa. They would talk about this terrible giant creature called Jobar that would come and seize naughty children. and there was one place that they would, the nomads would pass on their caravans in West Africa. It was in a big cliff area called Tigwidi. And the parents would point to these gigantic, terrifying skeletons emerging out of the cliff, and they would say those are the bones of Jobar, and you can see how big and scary this monster is. So if you don't behave on this trip, that's what'll come after you. And then that makes the stories all too real, right? When the adults are pointing out these conspicuous, scary bones of some monster. Well, it turns out that those bones that the Tuareg nomads were using to scare their kids happened to be the remains of herds. It's a mass death site of colossal 70-foot-long dinosaurs, sauropods, and they were discovered by paleontologists much later, a team from the University of Chicago. And the team of paleontologists was going through West Africa. They knew already that the geology would hold dinosaur fossils, but they didn't know where they were. So they asked the Tuareg nomads whether they knew of any places with gigantic, remarkable, enormous bones that they didn't recognize. And so Tuareg guides led the paleontologists to the Tigwidi Cliff and pointed out these fossil skeletons of Jobar weathering out of the ground. And they, when they told the story about these gigantic creatures that they said might have been something like gigantic camels, right? So these monsters are, once again, they have some features of a known animal. To the nomads, the biggest animal they knew was the camel. It has a long neck, big body, and long legs. So these are exquisitely preserved fossils. In fact, they're the most complete skeletons of sauropods ever found. So the nomads tried to explain it by saying there were gigantic camel-like monsters in the remote past that must have been wiped out by an immense flood long ago. Well, it turns out that their insight about what happened to these huge sauropods is that they did die in an enormous and catastrophic flash flood about, I guess, about 130 million years ago. And so here we have a story that the people noticed this. They told the story. They tried to explain it and account for it. And it was a story that they could confirm every time they passed that cliff. There would be new fossils of these gigantic sauropods eroding out. So the story, that's a trigger for telling the story. You were asking how would the story be perpetuated in this case? Every time you go by that cliff each year, you see more of these skeletons. And they were correct that they had died in a flash flood. The paleontologists, to their credit, I think, called the new species Jobaria tigwidensis, after Jobar, the terrible monster of the nomads.
That's good stuff. Of course, ancient people would come upon fossils of dinosaurs, and they
Yeah.
have no sense of where these possibly could have come from scientifically.
Right. Yeah.
And that's what you do. You're like, oh my God, look at this. This is somewhere.
No, this is not something you just, you plow up a thigh bone in your field. Say you're a Greek farmer in the time of Homer. You're plowing your field with your oxen, and you plow up yet another gigantic bone made of stone that you recognize as a femur, as a thigh bone, and it's as tall as you are. Well, that's not just something you toss aside as a rock in your field. You try to explain it. You take it to the temple. You compare it to your own thigh bone. You know about animal anatomy, and the biggest animal you know is an ox, and this is way bigger. And so the explanations that the Greeks came up with these were giants, just like in our myths. Now, we don't know, we'll never know which comes first, a story about giants, legends about giants, myths about giants, or observations of enormous, inexplicable, gigantic limb bones buried in the ground where giants supposedly lived in the deep past. We don't know which came first. But we do know that if you have myths about giants and you plow up a thigh bone or a shoulder blade that's 3 times the size of yours, you'll refer to those myths to try to explain it.
Yeah. We got a problem here, guys. There's probably others of these out there, or you could see how it would become a quote unquote meme, how everyone would be wildly interested in this.
Absolutely. And in my previous book, The First Fossil Hunters, about what the Greeks and Romans and other ancient people of that time, how they discovered and interpreted remarkable remains of extinct, in this case, not dinosaurs, but megafauna like mammoths and mastodons and giant rhinoceroses and cave bears, things like that. These things were eroding out of the land around the Mediterranean on a continual basis. They're revealed by people plowing their field or digging a well. If you think about digging a well, that's like a core sample, right? And we have ancient texts saying that they found remarkable remains and bones and teeth and footprints whenever they were doing these, just daily tasks about farming. They would come across these bones, but also remarkable remains, fossils would be revealed after storms because it would wash away and weather out fossils that had been buried deep in the ground. They also were eroding out of riverbanks and along the ocean. So also revealed by earthquakes. As I say, you don't just throw this aside. You try to explain it, and they came up with fairly rational explanation. These were giants, and they anthropomorphized them usually, and said these the fossils of mastodons, right? Prehistoric elephants and mammoths, but human beings are mammals just like elephants. All mammals have the same morphology of bones. So a mammoth shoulder blade or femur is exactly the same morphology or shape as a human shoulder blade or thigh bone. It looks exactly the same, only it's 3 times the size. And I think it's interesting that the ancient Greeks said, well, there were once giants living in the land of Greece. They no longer exist because these bones have been in the earth so long that they've turned to stone. So they actually didn't expect to see a giant. They actually correctly understood that these bones came from what we might call deep time. And they collected them, they measured them, and they brought them to temples and shrines for display as giants from the wonderful world of myth.
Wow. Myth making, story making, we're not done with this. We're still doing it in our own day. How do you see geomyths now and of the future?
Well, that's an interesting question that really struck me when I was first began studying geomythology, that these stories are a timeless, universal impulse, obviously, because we have them going back tens of thousands of years. And they're about disasters and catastrophes and upheavals of just earth-shaking upheavals. And so what sorts of popular folklore would arise thousands of years from now, or millions of years from now, when people try to, say, trace the origins of climate change? Because there's going to be some big climate changes. And how would people try to account for the origins? When did this start? Or how did this particular upheaval, obviously caused by climate change, happen? Or maybe they'll try to understand the relationship between fracking. I mean, people are doing a lot of fracking now, but they may continue, and scientists are already noticing that fracking causes earthquakes in places that never had earthquakes before. So there may be stories about that. We may change. Earth's population may change quite a bit. Maybe instead of being totally overpopulated, we're going to shrink back down to a very small number of human beings on Earth. And then when that happens, who will believe that the Earth's population was once like 8 billion people? They'll find evidence of high populations and try to figure out what the heck happened here. And I have already mentioned indigenous peoples in South America are creating stories and telling stories to explain the shrinking and melting of glaciers in South America. And who will believe that there used to be even something called a glacier, or that there were these frozen snowscapes that covered about 10% of the planet? Nobody will remember that. And there may be memories embedded in stories that people tell.
Yeah, I feel like we're about to we're going to add to the human collection of flood stories, of flood myths, and whenever
Yes.
I go back, and I'm a big fan of the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of
Yes.
our most ancient complete stories that we found at least written down. And, when you look at that flood, if I recall correctly, and I might be confusing it with other Mesopotamian myths, but if I recall correctly, I think Marduk, the god, got so upset and annoyed by all the noise the humans were making, he brought a flood to wipe them out.
The irritable gods. They're very whimsical in their punishments, but pretty devastating. By the way, my cat's name is Enkidu.
Gilgamesh's closest companion.
Exactly. I think it translates to animal companion.
Yeah, and of course
and
Enkidu's so interesting, right? Because he's born in the wild. He runs with the gazelles until he's civilized. I mean, and that, to me, Gilgamesh has always been a story about civilization. And they say, ancient Sumer is the birth of civilization.
Yeah.
But it also, to me, was a story about environmental destruction.
Yes, and think Enkidu is the kind of noble, savage type, the more primitive type, and yet think of how Gilgamesh mourns his passing. It's his best friend. So, that's a fascinating.
It makes him wander the earth in contemplation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Adrienne Mayer has been our guest. Adrienne Mayer is a research scholar in classics and the history of science at Stanford University. She has joined us for a conversation about her book. It's called Mythopedia, a brief compendium of natural history lore. Adrienne Mayer, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you greatly.
I have too. Thank you very much, Mitch.
And you are listening to Letters and Politics on listener-supported KPFA in Berkeley, KFCF in Fresno, and KPFK in Los Angeles. I am Mitch Jeserich, coming to you here in the final week of at least my home station, KPFA's Fall Fund Drive. This is the time, a very important time, that we come to you asking you for your financial contributions to keep this radio station, this historic radio station, on the air. We are offering a thank you gift today. The book that we were in conversation with Adrian Mayer about, Mythopedia, a brief compendium of natural history lore, is available for a contribution of $110. We were also at a discounted rate of $150. Throw in the Letters and Politics Ancient History Collection. This is a collection of all of the programs that we have done on ancient history over the years. We've curated a website of it, and it's all there. And I'll have to include this one. I haven't put it there yet, we have a longer interview than we were able to bring you today. You'll get the whole thing at the Ancient History Collection, Letters and Politics Ancient History Collection. You can get that alone for a contribution of $100. And you know me, you can get it for free by just going on online and searching for it. But we are asking for your support because that's what public broadcasting is all about. So we'll send you a link to that for a contribution of $100. But for a discounted rate of $150, you'll get the book Mythopedia, a brief compendium of natural history lore by Adrian Mayer, and the Letters and Politics Ancient History Collection together at a discounted rate of $150, or the book alone at $110. The phone number to call for KPFA listeners in the Bay Area in Northern California, this is also true for KFCF listeners in the Central Valley, the number you're going to call is 1-800-439-5732. 1-800-439-5732, and online at kpfa.org. For our friends in Southern California listening to KPFK in Los Angeles, the number you're going to call is 818-985-5735. 818-985-5735, and online at kpfk.org. I have about 12 minutes left with you, and I have been given a challenge from two listeners, Robert in Moss Beach and Brian in Vallejo. Together are challenging us to raise $1,200 this hour. If we can do that, if we could raise $1,200, that would mean $2,400 for the hour, which is important because as I speak to you now, and I only have access to the information of my home radio station, KPFA. But as I speak to you now, we are 63% of the way towards the goal, even though we're probably closer to 70% of the way through this fund drive. So we're a little bit behind, but not so significantly behind where we are hitting the panic button yet. We are always usually a little bit behind as we enter the final 2 days of a fund drive, and usually those final 2 days will be the biggest days in raising funds to keep this historic radio station on the air. That's where like a big amount of money usually comes in. But the question is, can we be within striking distance of making our overall goal? And that's what makes this moment in which $1,200 is on the table. They are making it conditional, and they are also trying to help me encourage you to donate to this historic radio station. If we could do it, it would be so important because that would be $2,400 for the hour. And again, that's how we get within striking distance here in a few days when we wrap up this fund drive. We won't be extending it, and that's very important. But in not extending it, it's important we get to that goal. So the phone number again for KPFA listeners and KFCF listeners is 1-800-439-5732. 1-800-439-5732, and online at kpfa.org. For Southern California, listening to KPFK in Los Angeles, the number you're going to call is 818-985-5735. 818-985-5735, and online at kpfk.org. Forgive me. I do want to thank Steve in Guerneville for Steve's generosity, and Annabella in San Rafael, Bella asked me if I've been able to read Bobby Wisdom's, I guess it's a book that was mailed to the station a couple of months ago. You know, Annabella, I'm not always at the station, and getting me something is mailing me, especially if I don't know it's coming, is not the best way to get something to me. But I can go, and I will be going back to the station here shortly, and I will look for that package, Annabella. But yeah, folks, living in this new sort of digital world, communicating over more traditional forms. Of course, radio is a traditional form in itself. Doesn't always get to me, Annabella. So I apologize. I have not seen that package. To my friend Joe Podvin, I did want to tell you, if you are listening, I did see your book you sent me of your poetry, and I'm going to respond with a letter once I get to it. Of course, I am asking for a contribution as I am leaving this program here in less than 2 weeks. As I do so, I want to stress that I think it's really important to support this radio station. It's a radio station I love. It's a radio station that gave me an opportunity in which no one else ever would. And that's because of you. And this radio station is bringing in new, young, fresh talent and people who have the drive and the eagerness to broadcast on their airwaves. And we need to make sure this radio station is here for everyone and for the future, because it's a community. And I'll still be a part of this community. I will still be a part of this community. I'll come back for special broadcast and stuff like that. I've received a number of emails. It's not in the thousands. I don't even know if it's in the hundreds. I don't even know if it's 100 yet. But I have received emails, really heartfelt emails from many of you, and I haven't been able to respond to them. And the reason why is because some of them have expressed a little bit of sadness, a little bit of emotion, and I it puts me in that mode, and I'll still be around. I mean, please remember, I'll still be around. But it puts me in, but I just don't want to respond to them flippantly. You know, sometimes you can get away with responding to emails just by saying, thank you for taking the time to write. Much appreciated. Mitch Jusrich. Right? But it doesn't feel proper to sort of respond to some of these notes like that. And then some other notes come in, and I'm still working, still have a job, and I've kind of gotten buried in them. But it doesn't mean I haven't seen them. And it certainly doesn't mean I haven't felt them. And it certainly has deepened kind of this experience, in which I was hoping just to kind of step out quickly without anyone noticing, sort of how I exist in the world. I guess on the upside, I never wanted to be where I'm not wanted. I mean, sometimes I found myself in that situation, but that nobody wants to be in that situation, right? I'm not alone in that. And I've always tried to leave before I wore out my welcome, and maybe for some of you, that is the case. And you know, it's better than, well, we were wondering when you're going to leave. Anyways, I'm still around. Just things are going to transform and change, but this radio station is my connection to you. This radio station is my community. I don't really have a community. I mean, I have a little local community thanks to a coffee shop where I live, where I got to meet some of my neighbors, so that's there. But the community that I've had for a long time now, that is my community, is you, is this radio station. And I do come to you asking you to nourish it and support it with a contribution that you can afford, that's according to your means, and that you feel good about. It could be $25, it could be $50, it could be $75, it could be $1,000. I just ask what you could do, that you don't have to look at your bank statement to see if it's possible to do. We are offering a thank you gift. Again, the book Mythopedia is yours for a contribution of $110. If you do $150, we'll also send you the link of the Letters and Politics Ancient History Collection, which is dozens of shows that we have done on ancient history over the years. I'll have to add this one to it, and I will. The number again is 1-800-439-5732. That's for KPFA and KFCF listeners. 1-800-439-5732. And online at kpfa.org. In Southern California, listening to KPFK in Los Angeles, the number is 818-985-5735. 818-985-5735, and online at kpfk.org. We are $50 towards that $1,200 challenge. I'm a little bit concerned right now because there are no listeners calling in right now. I know that, I believe, anyways, that was a fascinating conversation, not because of me, but because the guest was really fascinating, the information that she knew. And I think this kind of stuff helps deepen the day. I saw the listener stats online. It was healthy. It wasn't the most ever, but it was healthy. It was a healthy amount of audience we had, at least listening online. So I know there are people out there. Maybe not making this challenge now would be that actually, Mitch, it was time for you to leave. In fact, if you can help me get fired before, that might even be better. But the truth is, I still very much love this radio station. I love this radio network. I feel quite privileged in being able to say that I feel like it has been good to me. Not everyone always feels that way, even when they do love the station, because we all have these ideas of what the station could be and should be. There's always competing interests and different ideas, and it should be, because that's what a community is, right? Of different perspectives and ideas and positions on things, and we're coming in, and here we are, and we're trying to hash it all out. But I do feel privileged in being able to say I feel like this place has been good to me, and I want to be good to it, and I want to support this radio station always. And I want to support this radio station raising funds, because I know from being on the inside that without contributions, it won't exist. It does have to operate within this capitalist world, capitalist framework. There are financial obligations. It has to be able to meet in order to stay on the air. And the reality is KPFA and KPFK in Los Angeles and KFCF in Fresno have taken a very different direction to get there, where this is not a for-profit entity. This is not a place that goes, well, what can we put on the air that's going to raise the most money? That's not what we do. That's not the heart of public broadcasting and the heart of community radio, right? Because what we're doing is we're asking people to support this radio station, something in the content that they get on this radio station. We're asking you to support that, which is something that you can get for free anyways. You don't have to donate. And it's important that it's here for everyone, regardless of their ability to be able to make a donation. But it only happens if people take an active role, and if they are in position to donate something, to do so, to live deliberately, as Henry David Thoreau has so often written about. The number, again, for KPFA listeners in the San Francisco Bay Area and KFCF listeners in the Central Valley, 1-800-439-5732, 1-800-439-5732, and online at kpfa.org. In Southern California, listening to KPFK in Los Angeles, 818-985-5735, 818-985-5735, and online at kpfk.org. Still no callers, so I don't think we're going to make this challenge. However, over the next few minutes, you can still get your calls in if you want to help us. 1-800-439-5732. 1-800-439-5732. And online at kpfa.org. Thank you.
Voice synonymous with passion, integrity, and vision. No other station has been playing voices like these except KPFA.
You're listening to 94.1 KPFA and 89.3 KPFB in Berkeley, 88.1 KFCF in Fresno, and online worldwide at kpfa.org.